The test comes back negative. You are not my son. Diane says it out loud to the empty kitchen, more to herself than to him. From the doorway, he doesn't flinch. Doesn't matter what a piece of paper says, he tells her. I live here now. My name's on your accounts. I'm not going anywhere. Diane's voice shakes. Then who are you? He lets the silence sit for a moment before he answers. Someone who knows exactly what you did 38 years ago. Diane Coleman stands in her kitchen at 11 at night, phone shaking in her hand, the DNA results glowing on the screen like an accusation. 99% probability of no biological relationship. Not a match. Not close. Down the hall, she can hear him moving through her house like he owns it, because in every way that matters on paper, he now does. Her name is still on the deed, but his name is on the checking account, the credit card, the durable power of attorney she signed 8 months ago, believing she was finally getting her son back. She looks up from the phone. He is already standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her read it. He knew what it would say before she did. And for the first time since he walked into her life, Diane understands she may already be too late to undo what she signed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a 64-year-old widow ended up trapped in her own kitchen, afraid of a man she had fed, clothed, and legally handed her finances to, you have to go back 38 years, to a small Ohio town where a 17-year-old girl named Diane Whitfield fell hard for a boy 2 grades ahead of her named Nathan Cole. Nathan drove a rusted-out pickup truck he'd bought with money he never fully paid back, and he had a way of making Diane feel like she was the only interesting thing in a town where nothing interesting ever happened. He worked odd jobs at the feed store and the gas station, always between plans, always one scheme away from getting out of that town for good. Diane's parents disapproved of him from the beginning, calling him restless, unreliable, a boy who would leave a mess behind and let someone else clean it up. They were right, though Diane wouldn't understand exactly how right for another 38 years. Diane was 17 when she discovered she was pregnant, and the fear of that moment never fully left her, even decades later. She told Nathan first, expecting panic, expecting him to run, and for 3 agonizing weeks, he did exactly that, disappearing without a word, while Diane sat with the secret alone, terrified to tell her own mother. When Nathan finally resurfaced, he offered apologies instead of answers, vague promises about getting a real job, about doing right by her, promises that evaporated the moment Diane's father found out and forbade Nathan from setting foot on their property again. Diane's parents made the decision swiftly, and with the finality small towns were known for in that era. She would carry the pregnancy quietly, out of sight of the neighbors, and the baby would be placed through a private adoption agency 2 counties away before Diane returned to finish her senior year, as though nothing had happened at all. The day Diane signed the adoption papers remained, for the rest of her life, the single hardest hour she ever lived through, though she rarely allowed herself to think about it directly. She was permitted to hold the baby for 11 minutes before a nurse gently took him from her arms, and she remembered counting every one of those minutes, trying to memorize the weight of him, the exact color of his eyes, knowing she would never be allowed to see him again. Nathan did not come to the hospital. He sent no message, no flowers, nothing at all, and Diane understood in that silence exactly how alone she truly was, in the decision that had been made for her. She went home 3 days later, put on a cardigan her mother had picked out, and returned to high school the following Monday, where classmates asked if she'd been sick, and she said only that she had been. Diane never spoke of that pregnancy again in any real detail, not to her closest friends, not to the man she eventually married, not even to herself in any way she allowed to surface during daylight hours. Richard Coleman came into her life 4 years later, steady and dependable in every place Nathan had been reckless. A man who fixed things instead of breaking them, and who never once made Diane feel like a burden. They built a marriage on affection, routine, and one significant unspoken agreement that certain parts of Diane's past would remain sealed away permanently. They tried for years to have children of their own and were never able to, a private grief Diane carried quietly throughout their 31 years of marriage, layered directly on top of the older grief she had never allowed herself to fully feel. When Richard passed away 2 years ago from a sudden heart condition, Diane found herself alone for the first time in over 3 decades, in a 4-bedroom house built for a family that had never fully arrived. Richard had been, by every account from everyone who knew them, the steadying force Diane had needed since the day they met, a man who ran a small hardware store downtown and coached Little League on weekends despite never having children of his own to cheer for. He filled their house with routines Diane came to depend on completely: Sunday pancakes, Friday movie nights, the particular way he hummed while fixing whatever had broken that week. He never once pressed Diane about the parts of her past she kept sealed away, sensing early in their courtship that some doors were not his to open, and Diane loved him fiercely for that restraint, even as it meant carrying her secret entirely alone for 31 years of marriage. Losing him didn't just take away a husband. It took away the one person who had made her feel, without ever knowing the full truth, that she was still worth loving completely. The months after Richard's death moved slowly and without shape. Diane filled her calendar with church committees, a weekly grief support group at the community center, and long afternoons rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging, anything to avoid sitting still in a house that had grown too large and too quiet for one person. Neighbors checked in out of habit at first, then less often as the initial wave of sympathy faded into the background noise of ordinary life continuing around her. Her closest and most consistent companion during this period was Carol Ann Whitmore, a widow herself, who lived 2 houses down and had known Diane for over 20 years without ever hearing the full story of the baby given up in secret nearly 4 decades earlier. It was Carol who eventually suggested Diane try one of the popular ancestry websites, thinking it might be a lighthearted way to learn more about her family tree and feel a little less alone in the evenings. Carol's own instincts around manipulation had been sharpened years earlier, long before Caleb ever entered the picture, through an experience she rarely discussed with anyone outside her immediate family. In the 2 years following her own husband's death, a distant cousin had ingratiated himself into her life with a similar warmth and urgency, offering to help manage her finances during a period when grief had left her unable to focus on much of anything. Carol had caught it early, before real damage was done, but the memory of how easily she'd nearly handed over control of her own accounts to someone leaning on family loyalty had stayed with her permanently. It was that old, hard-won wariness, more than any specific suspicion of Caleb himself at first, that kept Carol asking the quiet questions Diane herself was too hopeful to ask. It was in that specific kind of loneliness, the kind that makes a person susceptible to exactly the wrong sort of hope, that the message arrived. A private note through the Ancestry platform, sent by a user identifying himself as Caleb Hayes, 37 years old, raised by an adoptive family outside Pittsburgh, searching for his birth mother for the better part of a decade. He explained that the site's DNA matching algorithm had flagged Diane's profile as a likely close relation, and that the little he knew about his own adoption, a private placement through an agency in Ohio, the approximate birth year, seemed to align with what the match suggested. His message was careful and gentle, almost apologetic in tone, acknowledging that this might be overwhelming, that he understood completely if she wasn't ready to respond. Diane read that message 11 times before she allowed herself to cry, and by the 12th reading, she had already begun composing her reply. What followed was, by Diane's own later account to Carol, the happiest month she had experienced since Richard's death, and in some ways, the happiest month she could remember in years. Caleb was patient with her questions and generous with details that appeared, on the surface, to line up almost perfectly. He knew the general region where the adoption agency had operated. He said his adoptive parents had always told him his birth mother was a teenager from a small town, a detail that matched Diane's story with an accuracy that felt, to her, like undeniable proof rather than a plausible guess anyone could make from limited information. He sent childhood photographs, though always framed as memories too painful to revisit fully, always slightly too vague to independently verify. Diane, starved for connection and carrying 38 years of buried guilt, did not question these small gaps the way a more skeptical person might have. She wanted this to be true with an intensity that overrode her own better instincts. Their correspondence deepened over the following weeks into something that felt, to Diane, like the slow mending of a wound she had never told anyone she was carrying. Caleb asked thoughtful questions about her life with Richard, about her own parents, about what it had been like growing up in that particular corner of Ohio. He shared stories, always slightly incomplete, about a difficult adoptive father and a mother who had passed away when he was in his 20s. Stories designed less to inform than to invite sympathy, to position himself as a man who had already suffered enough that Diane's guard would lower further with every exchange. When Diane finally worked up the courage to ask about a certified DNA test through a proper lab rather than relying solely on the Ancestry site's estimate, Caleb responded with warmth rather than resistance, saying he would love nothing more than official proof, though he gently suggested they get to know each other first, in person, before turning their reunion into paperwork. Diane agreed without a second thought. 3 months into their correspondence, Caleb proposed a visit, and Diane spent the 2 weeks beforehand in a state of nervous, overwhelming anticipation, cleaning the guest room, pulling out old photo albums, rehearsing what she might say to the son she hadn't seen since he was 11 minutes old. There were, if Diane was honest with herself later, small flickers of doubt even during those hopeful early weeks, moments she noticed and then deliberately buried before they could take root. A detail about his adoptive father's occupation that shifted slightly between 2 separate messages. A story about his childhood bedroom that didn't quite match a photograph he'd sent weeks earlier. Diane found herself doing what she would later recognize as a particular kind of self-deception. One grief counselors would tell her was common among people desperate enough for reconciliation. She wasn't ignoring the inconsistencies so much as translating them, in real time, into evidence that made the story work, rather than evidence that unraveled it. Every small crack got smoothed over with an explanation she supplied herself, because supplying it herself was easier than losing the son she had only just found. The reunion itself, when it finally happened, was staged with an emotional precision that Diane, in the moment, mistook entirely for authenticity. Caleb arrived with a modest suitcase and almost no verifiable information about his actual life, deflecting gently every time Diane asked about his job, his previous address, his adoptive family's full names, always redirecting the conversation back toward her, toward what she remembered, toward what she needed to hear in that instant. He called her Mom for the first time on his second night in her home, his voice cracking with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and Diane wept in a way she hadn't allowed herself to weep since the day she signed those adoption papers 38 years earlier. Caleb's visit, originally framed as a single week, stretched first into 2, then into a month, through a series of small and reasonable-sounding complications. His lease back in Pennsylvania had apparently fallen through. His employer had let him go during an unexpected round of layoffs. He framed each obstacle as fate, conspiring to keep him close to the mother he had only just found. And Diane, who had spent 2 years rattling around an empty house, welcomed the extended company without hesitation. She gave him the guest bedroom permanently, then a key to the front door, then unrestricted access to the cabinet in the guest bathroom where she kept emergency cash. Neighbors noticed the shift in Diane almost immediately, remarking to one another how much lighter she seemed, how she had started laughing again at church functions, introducing Caleb proudly as the son she had waited nearly 4 decades to meet. One particular evening, several weeks into his extended stay, stood out sharply in Diane's memory later, once she finally understood what she had actually been looking at during that dinner. Caleb had been describing, in vivid and emotional detail, a memory of his adoptive mother teaching him to fish at a lake he named specifically, a story that brought tears to Diane's eyes as she imagined a childhood she'd had no part in. Later that same week, mentioning the story to Carol, Diane noted offhandedly that the lake Caleb described didn't actually exist anywhere near the Pennsylvania town he claimed to have grown up in, a detail she had noticed and then quietly, deliberately set aside rather than examined too closely. She told herself he'd simply misremembered the name after so many years. It would not be the last inconsistency she talked herself out of that season. Carol Ann Whitmore was, in many ways, the only person in Diane's orbit who resisted the pull of the story from the very beginning, though even she wrestled with her own doubts about whether her suspicion was fair to a man who had apparently done nothing but show up and love Diane. It was during a quiet cup of coffee, several weeks into Caleb's extended stay, that Carol gently asked him about his adoptive parents, his childhood home, the agency that had handled his placement, hoping simply to understand the man who had so thoroughly reshaped her friend's life. Caleb's answers came slower than usual that afternoon, vaguer, wrapped in soft deflections like, "It's complicated," and "I try not to dwell on that part of things." Carol mentioned the exchange to Diane that same evening, carefully, without accusation, and Diane's response was immediate and unusually sharp, the kind of defensiveness that comes not from certainty, but from a fear of losing something too precious to interrogate. It was around this same period, though neither Diane nor Carol would learn of it until much later, that a woman 2 counties over named Eleanor Briggs received a strikingly similar message through a different genealogy platform from a user identifying himself under yet another name, claiming a DNA match to a son she had placed for adoption decades earlier under circumstances almost identical to Diane's own. Eleanor, sharper and more skeptical by nature, or perhaps simply less isolated at the time, asked for a certified DNA test within the first 2 weeks and never received a satisfactory answer, ending the correspondence before it went any further. Eleanor later told investigators that something about the messages had felt rehearsed to her from the very start, too polished, too perfectly aligned with details she had never shared publicly anywhere, except in a single grief journal she kept locked in a desk drawer. She couldn't explain how a stranger claiming to be her biological son had known the exact wording she'd once used to describe her regret, phrases that felt lifted almost verbatim from private conversations she'd had with only one other person years earlier, a conversation she could no longer clearly recall having ever repeated to anyone else. She blocked the account and moved on with her life, never once suspecting that the same voice, wearing a different name, was already testing its script on a woman just 40 miles away who would prove far less guarded than she had been. The pattern, invisible to either woman at the time, was already repeating itself across the region, a rotating cast of names and invented backstories built around the same emotional formula, tested and refined against whichever woman proved most willing to believe. By the 4th month of Caleb's residence in her home, financial changes began appearing that Diane herself had not directly initiated, though she struggled at the time to name the discomfort they created in her. A joint checking account was opened at her local bank, with Caleb listed as a co-owner, something Diane recalled agreeing to only in the vaguest terms, remembering a conversation framed around making things easier in case something happened to her health as she aged. A durable power of attorney followed shortly afterward, drafted by an attorney Caleb personally recommended, one Diane had never met or verified independently, signed at her own kitchen table with Caleb's reassuring hand resting on her shoulder throughout the entire process. Caleb framed every step as an act of devotion, a son finally able to care for the mother he'd been kept from for 37 years, and Diane, moved and grateful, saw only love, where a more cautious eye might have seen the careful architecture of control being built around her. By the 6th month, small inconsistencies had accumulated into something Diane could no longer entirely ignore, even as she continued fighting against acknowledging it fully. Withdrawals appeared on bank statements for amounts she hadn't authorized, always modest enough to avoid raising alarm, a few $100s here, a cash advance there. Caleb had an explanation ready every time, framing each charge as a household expense or an emergency he hadn't wanted to trouble her with. Her credit card, which Caleb now carried for convenience, showed charges from electronics stores and restaurants in towns Diane had never once visited. When she finally asked about a $500 charge from an unfamiliar city 2 hours away, Caleb's warmth cooled for the first time since his arrival, and he accused her of not trusting the son she had only just found, twisting her reasonable concern into something that left her feeling cruel for having asked at all. Carol, watching from next door with growing unease, recognized a pattern she had heard described secondhand by a cousin who worked in adult protective services, though she had never expected to witness it unfolding this closely to someone she loved. Isolation dressed up as intimacy, financial access dressed up as devotion, and a victim too emotionally invested in the story to see the mechanism quietly operating beneath it. Carol began keeping careful, private notes of what she observed, dates of Caleb's occasional outbursts, the week Diane quietly stopped attending her regular church committee meetings, the afternoon Diane mentioned, almost in passing, that Caleb had suggested she no longer needed her weekly visits with Carol now that real family had finally come back into her life. That single comment, more than anything else, was what finally pushed Carol from quiet concern into deliberate action. Carol arrived at Diane's door on a Tuesday afternoon, timed carefully for a window, when she knew Caleb would be out running errands with Diane's car and Diane's credit card, and sat her oldest friend down for the most difficult conversation of their 2-decade friendship. She asked Diane directly whether she had ever seen legitimate adoption paperwork connecting Caleb to the agency from 38 years earlier, whether she had verified anything beyond the estimated match percentage from a consumer genealogy website, which Carol had researched and learned could sometimes suggest distant or coincidental genetic overlap, depending on regional population data. Diane, for the first time in nearly 7 months, felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with hope. She admitted quietly that she had never once requested the kind of certified, legally recognized DNA test used in actual paternity or maternity proceedings, only the casual estimate from the platform Caleb had first used to contact her. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table long after Caleb had gone to bed, Diane made the decision that would ultimately unravel everything, though she did not yet grasp the full scale of what she was about to uncover. She ordered a certified DNA testing kit online, the legally recognized kind used in court proceedings, framing the request to Caleb the next morning as something meant simply to give her peace of mind, a keepsake for a family record book she claimed to be assembling. Caleb resisted gently at first, citing the emotional toll of proving something he already knew in his heart to be true, but Diane, quietly fortified by Carol's support, held her ground for the first time in months. The kit arrived 4 days later. Both of them provided samples under Diane's direct supervision, sealed the envelope together at the kitchen table, and mailed it that same afternoon to the lab. The 2 weeks that followed the mailing of that envelope were unlike any period of Caleb's residence in Diane's home up to that point. His mood shifted noticeably, growing shorter with her over small things, spending more time away from the house on unexplained errands, checking his phone with an intensity that Diane, still clinging stubbornly to hope, chose to interpret as anxiety rather than calculation. He mentioned twice, almost testingly, that lab results were sometimes wrong, that DNA science had margins of error people didn't always understand, small seeds planted in advance of a result he seemed increasingly certain would not go his way. Diane noticed the shift but said nothing, spending those 2 weeks in a strange, suspended state between the life she had built around Caleb over the past 7 months and a growing, unwelcome awareness that she might soon lose it entirely, one way or another. The results arrived on a Thursday evening while Caleb was out, and Diane opened the envelope alone at her kitchen table with Carol on the phone, staying with her through every word of the report as she read it aloud with a trembling voice. Probability of biological relationship, effectively 0. Not a distant cousin, not a half-relation through some complicated family tangle. No relationship at all, by any measure the science could offer. Diane sat with the phone still pressed to her ear for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving, before she heard Caleb's key turn in the front door lock, and it was in that exact moment, watching a stranger walk into her own home as though he owned every square foot of it, that the confrontation from the very beginning of this story finally unfolded. The test came back negative, and when Diane said the words aloud, Caleb did not flinch, did not apologize, did not even attempt an explanation. He simply reminded her, with unsettling calm, that his name was already on her accounts and that he wasn't going anywhere. Word of what had happened moved through the small congregation Diane had proudly introduced Caleb to months earlier, faster than she was ready for, and the days immediately following the confrontation brought a different kind of pain layered on top of the betrayal itself. Well-meaning acquaintances asked careful questions at the grocery store. Church members who had once admired her reunion story now seemed to look at her with a mixture of pity and quiet judgment. The unspoken question of how she could have let a stranger this deep into her life, hanging in the air every time she left the house. Diane later admitted to Carol that this brief period of public embarrassment was, in some ways, nearly as difficult to carry as the fraud itself. A reminder of exactly how thoroughly her hope had been used against her, in front of everyone who knew her. What Diane did next surprised even Carol, who had braced herself for her friend to collapse entirely under the weight of the betrayal. Instead, Diane called her actual estate attorney the following morning, the one who had handled Richard's affairs for over a decade, rather than the unfamiliar lawyer Caleb had personally introduced her to for the power of attorney paperwork. Within days, that attorney confirmed what Diane had already begun to suspect in her bones. The lawyer Caleb had recommended held no verifiable license anywhere in the state of Ohio, and the power of attorney document itself had never been legally valid to begin with. An emergency petition to revoke it and freeze the joint account was filed that same week, and the moment it went through, Caleb stopped coming home altogether, leaving behind a suitcase, an unpaid cell phone bill, and no explanation, as though the version of him that had called her mom for 7 months had simply been switched off like a light. It was Carol, sitting with Diane over an old box of photographs a few evenings later, who finally said aloud what neither of them had wanted to voice directly. Something about the set of his jaw, the particular tilt of his head when he laughed, tugged at a memory Carol had heard only once before, in a half-finished story Diane had shared late one night years earlier, after a few glasses of wine. Diane went quiet for a long moment, then reached for a single photograph she had kept hidden away for 38 years, a boy of 19, standing in front of an old pickup truck, grinning the exact same crooked grin. Nathan Cole, the father of the baby she had given up so long ago. Not a stranger who had studied her carefully from a distance, but the one living person who had actually lived through that secret beside her, and who had apparently spent decades learning exactly how to turn her deepest regret into a door he could quietly walk through. Diane sat with that photograph for a long time, tracing the outline of a face she hadn't seen in 38 years, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't with the shattered voice Carol had braced herself for. "He didn't take anything from me that I didn't already lose the day I let him disappear," Diane said, her voice steady, in a way that surprised them both. "I spent 38 years grieving a boy I gave away, and a man who ran from it. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life grieving him twice." Carol later said that was the exact moment she watched her closest friend stop being a victim in her own story and start becoming the author of what came next. Diane pressed charges the following week, cooperated fully with the local detective assigned to the case, and refused, from that point forward, to hide from any part of it. The detective assigned to Diane's case connected several loose threads that had gone unnoticed for months, eventually linking Nathan Cole's most recent alias to the earlier unsuccessful attempt made on Eleanor Briggs 2 counties over. The very same pattern of invented backstory and manufactured DNA match Eleanor had wisely refused to pursue further. With 2 separate women willing to testify, along with financial records pulled directly from Diane's bank, investigators finally had enough to build a case that would stick where previous, quieter attempts elsewhere had apparently slipped through the cracks. Piecing together Nathan's movements over the previous decade took investigators several additional weeks, revealing a pattern far larger than either Diane or Eleanor had imagined possible. He had used at least 3 other names in 2 other states, each time targeting a woman recently widowed or divorced, each time building some version of the same story, a long-lost relative reaching out through a genealogy platform, a slow campaign of manufactured intimacy, and eventually, access to whatever finances the woman controlled. None of the earlier cases had resulted in a conviction, either because the victims were too embarrassed to pursue charges publicly or because the financial losses, while devastating to the individuals involved, hadn't been large enough on their own to justify the resources a full investigation required. Diane's case was the first to combine a large enough financial loss with 2 willing witnesses and a detective determined enough to trace the pattern back through all of it. Nathan Cole was arrested 3 weeks after Diane filed her report, attempting yet another version of the same scheme on a 3rd widow in a neighboring county, one whose adult son, fortunately, had already grown suspicious enough to intervene before any real damage was done. Diane sat in the courtroom on the day of Nathan's sentencing, watching a man she had once loved as a teenager, and briefly, catastrophically, believed to be her long-lost son, get led out of the room in handcuffs. She felt something settle in her chest that surprised her, not triumph exactly, but a deep and quiet relief, the kind that comes only when a door held shut for decades finally locks firmly from the other side. The bank, working closely with her attorney in the months that followed, recovered the overwhelming majority of what had been taken over those 7 months, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, Diane felt the weight of that old, buried secret finally lift, replaced not by shame, but by something closer to peace. The week after the sentencing, Diane drove alone to the cemetery where Richard was buried, something she hadn't done in months, unable to face him with what she'd allowed to happen in the house they'd built together. She sat on the grass beside his headstone for nearly an hour, and for the first time in 39 years of marriage and widowhood combined, she told him everything: the pregnancy at 17, the baby she'd given up, Nathan Cole, and the elaborate, cruel lie he'd built decades later to steal what Richard had spent a lifetime helping her rebuild. She said she was sorry for the silence she'd kept from him for 31 years of marriage, and somewhere in the telling, she realized the secret had never actually been the dangerous part. The silence around it was what had left her vulnerable enough for Nathan to walk through the door in the first place. In the year that followed, Diane rebuilt her life with a clarity and confidence she hadn't possessed even before any of this had begun. She used a portion of the recovered settlement to help launch a small local support circle for older adults navigating grief, loneliness, and the specific kind of family-shaped wounds that men like Nathan Cole knew exactly how to locate and exploit. Through that circle, Diane grew close with 2 other women, and the 3 of them began hosting Sunday dinners together, filling her once too quiet dining room with noise and laughter for the first time since Richard had passed away. The first of those 2 women, a retired schoolteacher named Patricia Malone, had lost her husband the same year Diane lost Richard, and had spent nearly as long convinced that no one else could possibly understand the particular shape of that silence. The second, a woman named Grace Farrell, had actually recognized pieces of her own story in a local news segment about Diane's case. A nephew who had once tried something similar with her modest savings before a suspicious bank teller intervened in time. The 3 of them, along with Carol, became something Diane hadn't expected to build again at 65. A family assembled entirely on purpose, chosen rather than inherited, bound by nothing except the decision to show up for one another every single week without fail. Carol, naturally, was there every single week too, seated in the chair she had claimed years earlier, the one true friend who had never once needed a DNA test to prove she belonged in Diane's life. Diane still keeps her certified test results in a folder, though it now sits on a shelf beside photographs of Richard, snapshots from her Sunday dinners, and a small keepsake box holding the single photograph she has of the baby boy she placed for adoption all those years ago. She also returned, quietly and without fanfare, to the church committee she had drifted away from during Caleb's time in her house, taking back a role organizing the annual harvest dinner that she had once loved before her attention had been redirected entirely toward a man who turned out to be no relation to her at all. The women on that committee, many of whom had watched Diane introduce Caleb so proudly months earlier, never once made her feel foolish for what had happened, several confiding quietly afterward that they too had ignored red flags in relationships or family situations of their own, rather than face an uncomfortable truth. Diane found an unexpected kind of healing in those conversations, discovering that her story, rather than isolating her further, had opened doors to honesty she hadn't realized so many of the people around her were also hungry for. She made peace, finally, with never searching for her biological son herself, choosing instead simply to hope that wherever he is loved, and that he never has to know how his own biological father once tried to steal his mother's future by pretending to be him. Diane Coleman walks into her kitchen most mornings now and makes coffee for a house full of friends, in a life that very nearly got stolen from her by a man wearing her own worst memory like a mask. It didn't. She got her house back. She got her name back. And for the first time since she was a frightened 17-year-old girl, Diane finally feels completely, unapologetically at home in her own life. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings before the others arrive, Diane still sits at that same kitchen table where the confrontation once unfolded, where the DNA envelope was opened, where a stranger once told her he wasn't going anywhere. The table looks the same as it always did, but everything that happens around it now is hers again, chosen deliberately, guarded carefully, and never again handed over simply because someone knew exactly which old wound to press. That, in the end, is the only inheritance Nathan Cole ever managed to leave her. Not her money, not her trust, but the hard-earned certainty that she would never again mistake desperation for family.